Picking up where we left off again, I promise this will be the last disturbance for this chapter. Much fewer trials and patients would have suffered to tell us what we need to know. However, these trials inadvertently show us something about fraud and other manipulations with the data. The nausea trials do not show a symmetric pattern as in figure 9.1, and the bias in trials comparing granisetron with placebo is huge. Seen figure 9.2. Pause and we'll look at the data. Really pause. Now, where were we? The most dramatic effects were seen in small trials, and it is clear that many small trials with poor effect or showing that placebo was better than the drug are missing. The bias was similarly large in the trials that had compared granisetron with an old cheap drug, doperidol. Trials that had been performed by a particularly prolific author, Yoshitaka Fuji, were also heavily biased. He was later found to have fabricated his data in 172 studies, of which were randomized trials. This is a world record. Figure 9.2, bias in trials comparing granisetron with placebo for postoperative nausea and vomiting. Results are shown for the use of a rescue antiemetic. Despite the huge amount of data, the Cochrane review couldn't conclude anything about the possible differences between the drugs. This must also be some sort of record for research waste. After 737 trials and 100,000 patients, no reliable conclusions can be made, although it's so simple to study postoperative nausea and vomiting. I have been a member of the drug committee at our hospital for 20 years, and in 2012, the clinicians wanted to get permission to use some new anti-nausea drugs as standard. One was palonosetron, which costs 44 times more than ondansetron and 17 times more than granisetron. We were told that in those trials that had been submitted to the drug agency for obtaining marketing approval, palonosetron had a similar effect to older cetrons when heavy chemotherapy was used, but was slightly better when chemotherapy caused less nausea and vomiting. 81% and 69% respectively did not develop nausea. I couldn't participate in the meeting, but I wanted the chairman of the committee against selective publication of the most positive results. I also noted that we needed access to the unpublished trials and their protocols, and that a full Cochrane review was needed if we wanted to know whether the new drugs were any better than the cheap ones. The minutes from the meeting said that it was agreed to allow the clinicians to use the expensive drugs when heavy chemotherapy was used. Where there was no advantage of palosentron, including a drug that costs 300 times as much as the cheapest one, and the clinician should carefully consider when the drug should be used. Experience has shown that such recommendations rarely prevent people from using expensive drugs, although it's impossible that they can be 300 times more valuable than the cheap ones. I withdrew my membership of our drug committee after 20 years of uninterrupted disappointment. No matter how shaky or irrational the arguments, or how expensive the new drugs, drug committees almost always please the clinicians. I think it's about not getting into trouble. Heads of departments are powerful and often on industry payroll, and if too many complaints are being made, top managers might not get their tenure renewed. It also takes time to say no, as protests are likely to ensue, and those at the top have far too little time already. I have discussed this with chairman of the drug committee elsewhere, and they have also experienced a lack of management support for unpopular decisions. We don't live up to our values as a profession. Drug salespeople may come to heads of departments and ask whether they will make an application to the drug committee with their tact understanding that those who refuse will be out of favor come conference time, and that is also how it works. The interactions between physicians and the industry were until recently chiefly of interest to medical ethicists. That is not the case any longer, and two previous editors of the New England Journal of Medicine, Marcia Engel and Jerome Cassier, and a previous editor of the BMJ, Richard Smith, each wrote a book with a telling title after they had stepped down as editors. The Truth About the Drug Companies, How They Deceive Us, and What to Do About It. On the Take, How Medicine's Complicity with Big Business Can Endanger Your Health. The Trouble with Medical Journals. Highly expensive drugs. I have tried to find out just how expensive drugs can be compared to the benefit they offer and yet succeed getting used. Treatment of one patient with biologic agents can cost up to 16,000 euros a year in Denmark, which is 120 times as much as treatment with conventional drugs. Biologic agents are widely used for rheumatoid arthritis, but a 2010 meta-analysis showed that they are not any better in retarding joint damage than a combination of two cheap disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs, DMARDs. Unfortunately, the meta-analysis came 4 months too late. The European League Against Rheumatism, EULAR, had posted new recommendations stating that biologic agents should be initiated without first trying therapy with a combination of DMARDs in patients whose arthritis was not sufficiently responsive to therapy with a single DMARD. The EULAR recommendations were based on a review of only a fraction of the published studies. But once an organization has issued new guidelines, it is extremely difficult to change them, even though, as in this case, billions of euros could be saved in the EU every year. In Denmark alone, the cost for biologic agents was 130 million euros in 2011. The authors of the meta-analysis recently conducted a more sophisticated network meta-analysis that confirmed their results. Gerudol Personal Communication. In 2010, the BMJ reported that a vaccine not to prevent cancer but to treat metastatic prostate cancer was approved by the FDA. It cost $93,000 for 3 doses, and who knows whether the doctors would try more doses if they didn't see signs of the expected effect, which is a life extension of merely 4 months. Water. Oh man. So much tech and in 2012, Denmark decided to pay for a drug against metastatic melanoma that costs about $100,000 for one patient and which prolongs life by 3.5 months. The oncologist sold the idea to the public by claiming that 10% of the patients would be cured, although the trials didn't in any way justify this generous interpretation. A member of the working group that decided to pay for the drug couldn't see it was a problem that she received money from the company that stood to benefit from her decision. In 2006, a new drug for head and neck cancer cost about $110,000 a year. The wooden spoon in futility I have seen so far goes to erlotinib for treatment of pancreatic cancer. Both FDA and the EMA approved it, although it only prolongs life by 10 days. Is toxic and will cost almost $500,000 for 1 year of life gained, 10 days for each of 36 patients that aren't even pleasant. Examples of even more expensive drugs follow in Chapter 20, but here is one about a drug that didn't work. Intravenous alpha 1 antitrypsin is used in some countries for patients with lung disease caused by inherited alpha 1 antitrypsin deficiency. Some lung specialists had successfully lobbied a political majority in the Danish parliament to agree to reimburse the drug, which may cost up to 116,000 euros annually per patient, and which is to be used in many years. As the deterioration in lung function is slow, and very slow if the patients don't smoke. Before the decision was made, I was asked to review the trials, and I found that there is no convincing evidence that the drug is effective. It took me only 4 weeks to produce the report, which we later published. It made the politicians decline to reimburse the drug, which saved Danish taxpayers at least 30 million euros every year. Something is terribly wrong in the way we prioritize. The most intensive and expensive therapy is often given in the last few days or weeks of life. It could be much better if we use this precious time constructively with our loved ones, instead of being pestered by the toxic effects of chemotherapy in a fight we cannot win. Such simple ideas have powerful enemies in interest groups after prominent doctors had declared publicly that they would abstain from life-prolonging chemotherapy if they got lethal cancer. The chairman of the Danish Cancer Society, Frid Olesen, reprimanded them by saying they harmed the trust between patients and doctors. They didn't. They gave very sound advice to the public. Why should the patients not have the same privileges as health professionals? Few oncologists and nurses are willing to accept the chemotherapy their patients endure for minimal benefit. In elderly patients, aggressive treatment is even more misplaced. What is more important to them is to maintain their independence and dignity, not a few extra intolerable weeks. What is even more remarkable is that the conservative attitude cancer societies don't like many in some cases not only improve the patient's quality of life, but also make them live longer. A randomized trial in patients with newly diagnosed metastatic non-small cell lung cancer showed that those assignments to palliative care early on received less aggressive treatment and lived 3 months longer. Drugs can kill you also when your life is almost over. Excess and hypertension. What we need more than anything else is to put a brake on the exploding expenditures on new drugs and their harms. It is independent drug trials. One trial, the 2002 All-Hat trial, shows how strong the counteracting forces of medico-industrial complex can be. With 33,357 patients, it was the largest hypertension trial ever conducted. It compared 4 drugs: daxazocin, an alpha blocker from Pfizer; amlodipine, a calcium channel blocker from Pfizer; lisinopril, an ACE inhibitor, and chlorothalidone, chloroth, chlorotha, chlorothalidone, a diuretic, and the doxosin arm was stopped prematurely as the drug was clearly inferior. However, Pfizer started a damage control campaign, which was very effective, as there was no decline in sales that year when the All Had study was presented at a large congress in California. Pfizer invited that doctors on sightseeing to endure they didn't learn about the results. In a press release, the American College of Cardiology used doctors to discontinue use of doxosin, but this was challenged with hours after Pfizer had contacted the college, which now said that the doctors should release its use. Rather unfortunate advice about a drug that had just been proven inferior, but it might have played a role that donations from Pfizer to the college exceeded $500,000 annually. All had demonstrated that the cheapest of the four tested drugs, the diuretic, was also the best. The chair of the All Had steering committee, Kurt Furberg, estimated that the use of the expensive calcium channel blocker and ACE inhibitor cost in excess of $8 to $10 billion without providing any benefit to patients, and in some instances adding more risk. The use of inferior drugs had caused heart failure in 40,000 patients in the United States. At the same time, they had to pay 20 times more for the inferior drugs. Unsurprisingly, the results generated a huge controversy with innumerable letters and papers written by seemingly independent whore doctors who were hired guns for the company. A paper from 2003 reported that Pfizer's other all-had drug, amlodipine, was the most sold antihypertensive drug in Norway, although it was 10 times as expensive as a diuretic, and although the evidence for a preventative effect on heart disease didn't exist. If doctors had used a diuretic rather than an amlodipine, $750 million could have been saved annually in Germany, the UK, and the United States. In 1996, amlodipine was the most heavily advertised drug in the New England Journal of Medicine, while there wasn't any single ad for diuretics. The All Had trial wasn't published in this journal, but in JAMA. An article from 2009 reported that the differences between the cost for the cheapest and most expensive ACE inhibitor was a factor of 30, and that Denmark could save about 40 million euros a year by using the cheapest drug. Denmark could save about 40 million euros. It looked like a no-brainer, but no. The chairman of the Danish Society for Hypertension, Hans Ibsen, declared that we need to be very cautious about changing drugs in patients with a well-regulated blood pressure, whereas another hypertension specialist, Abildgaard Jacobson, said that he had changed many patients' drugs without problems. Which of the two specialists was on industry payroll? That's a no-brainer. A year later, Ibsen shared his thoughts with us. He initially supported the use of losartan, the first angiostensin II receptor antagonist marketed by Merck, which was one of Ibsen's benefactors. When new similar drugs were introduced, Ibsen recommended those instead, although they were 10 to 20 times more expensive. The arrangement, the argument that hypertension research would disappear from Denmark if we didn't use the expensive drugs. In this, in this, Ibsen was supported by Novartis. Was supported by getting tired. When new similar drugs were introduced, Ibsen recommended that those instead, although they were 10 to 20 times more expensive, with the argument that the hypertension research would disappear from expensive. Ibsen recommended that those instead, although they were 20 times more expensive, with an argument that the hypertension research would disappear from Denmark if we didn't use the expensive drugs. In this, Ibsen was supported by the medical director of Novartis, another of his benefactors, who stated that Novartis conducted research to introduce their products on the market so that they would be used, and that she saw no great future for trials in Denmark if there wouldn't be subsequent sales. It was rather bold for Novartis, which is sold on I'm getting tired. Another of his benefactors, who stated that Novartis conducted research to introduce their products on the market so that damn, I'm tired. So that they would be used, and that she saw no great future trials in Denmark if there wouldn't be subsequent sales. It was rather bold for that Novartis, which sold one of the highly expensive new angiotensin 2 receptor antagonists, didn't try to hide the fact that its research wasn't research but marketing. A colleague who, like me, is a member of Doctors Without Sponsors, remarked about the astonishing revelations that were the purpose of research was to teach the doctors to use far too expensive drugs. It might be better than the research was performed elsewhere. We could have saved 67 million euros in just 1 year if all doctors had used losartan, which is an enormous amount of money for a small country. I mean this story because I cannot recall any other where people have been so honest about their shady motives. Ibsen once attacked me in our medical journal, saying I should be more positive toward the drug industry and acknowledge the important work sincere research did in collaboration with sincere companies. I asked what Ibsen meant by a sincere company and noted that he collaborated with Merck, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Novartis, all of which had received giant fines for fraud, and that tens of thousands of patients had lost their lives because of the misdeeds committed by Merck and Pfizer, since these patients died from cardiovascular events, which hypertension experts try to avoid. It might be expected that Ibsen would have refused to collaborate with such companies for the rest of his professional life. Rather than calling them sincere doctors, doctors have a remarkable capacity for denial, whereas the bereaved spouses cannot deny that their loved ones are dead because they took a drug they didn't need. One more page, guys. Patient organizations. A chapter on hard sell wouldn't be complete without mentioning patient organizations. They're usually funded by and speak with the same voice as Big Pharma. In 2006, a pan-European cancer campaign, Cancer United, was presented as a pioneering effort by a coalition of doctors, nurses, and patients to push for equal access to cancer care across the EU. It was entirely funded by Roche, the world's leading drug pusher, and marketing cancer drugs, some of which are exceedingly expensive. In other words, Herceptin for breast cancer and Avastin for bowel cancer. Roche's PR firm was the Secretariat, and the principal study on which the propaganda was based was funded by Roche. The study report was written by Nils Wilking and from Karolinska Institute in Stockholm and Berger from Jolson from Stockholm Schools of Economics. It received a lot of publicity but was seriously flawed, and its conclusions were unsupported by the data. It concluded it is clearly in the best interest of cancer patients that new innovative drug therapies are made available to them as soon as possible. Reduced or delayed access to cancer drugs has a very real impact on patient survival. Traditional companies speak it was, and their promotional materials said that the campaign aimed to collect 1 million signatures and would press the European Commission for an EU-wide strategy. The chairman of the European Cancer Patients Coalition found herself listed as a member of the campaign's executive board without her agreement. She and members of the European Parliament board without her agreement. She and members of the European Parliament board were without her agreement. And she and members of the European Parliament withdrew from her board. The chairman of the executive board, Professor John Smith, who committed editorial misconduct in his role as editor of the European Journal of Cancer in relation to one of our studies on mammography screening, wrote the foreword to the Karolinska report, said that the campaign was his idea, and expressed a wish that people should not stop seeing the industry as the enemy. Novo 7 for bleeding soldiers. In 2011, Novo Nordisk agreed to pay $25 million to resolve its civil liberty arising from... In 2011, Novo Nordisk agreed to pay $25 million to resolve its civil liabilities arising from the illegal promotion of its hemophilia drug. Novo 7 hemophilia is a very rare disease, but Novo promoted the drug, which contains factor 7, unlawfully to healthcare professionals as a congratulatory agent for trauma patients and similar uses, resulting in false claims to be submitted to government healthcare programs that were not reimbursed by those programs. The case involved a whistleblower lawsuit and an expansive corporate integrity agreement with the Department of Health and Human Services. The Justice Department suit alleged that Novo improperly paid influential U.S. Army physicians to use and promote Novo 7 and provide illegal incentives for the researchers. The company engaged in a fraudulent scheme to use kickbacks and off-label promotion to boost sales, which trebled in 5 years to $750 million in 2004 and exceeding $1 billion in 2007. The activities involved speaking engagements, positions on advisory boards, and unrestricted research grants for people working at the U.S. Army Institute of Surgical Research. In 2005, a heavily manipulated trial in 301 severely bleeding trauma patients was published in a little known journal that purported to show that Novo 7 worked. If true, there would have been sensational that would have been sensational, and we would have expected to see the trial published in the New England Journal of Medicine or the Medicine or the Lancet with huge reprint orders. The abstract was highly misleading and described two trials. Although it was only one trial, the data analysis was seriously flawed, using a new outcome that wasn't specifically tied to the protocol and an arbitrary cutoff for a number of transfusion, and excluding patients, and excluding we had patients from analysis who died within the first 48 transfusions. And excluding patients from analysis who died within the first 48 hours. The data message was so clumsily made that it was fairly easy to see that the trial hadn't shown any effect. The trial was funded by Novo and had a Novo employee and 4 physicians on Novo payroll among the authors. It was torn into pieces by experts also in the journal where it was published, which spoke of information laundering, but Novo research director Mads Korsgaard Thompson maintained that it was the physicians who stood for the positive conclusions and that the company had limited input into the paper. This is hard to believe as the statistician was also from Novo. A physician from my hospital acquired access to the protocol, which made it possible for him to see the manipulation. Some people believed in this mockery of science, and Novo embarked on a new trial, which my hospital declined to participate in. We had seen enough already. In 2006, 5 FDA physicians reported that 185 thromboembolic events were linked to Novo 7. In April 2011, 2 large studies concluded that there were no evidence that the drug prolonged life in any of its off-label uses. And in some studies of stroke and heart surgeries, Novo 7 actually increased the risk of stroke and heart attacks. What galled Cindy Wolf from Public Citizen the most was how Novo spent years pushing doctors to endorse off-label uses for Novo 7 and then issued a warning stating the drug caused potentially fatal blood clots if used in patients who don't have hemophilia. Novo promoted Novo 7 for soldiers, patients who don't have hemophilia. Novo promoted Novo 7 for soldiers from 2005 to 2007 with conferences and seminars that bore titles such as Stop the Bleeding, Bleeding Management in Military Trauma Care, Damage Control Resuscitation in Iraq, and Blood Product Effect on Survival for Patients with Combat-Related Injuries. The blood company got off easy in terms of the amount of money they paid, and no one went to jail. Novo denied any wrongdoing in an interview on Danish radio in 2008. Mads Krogsgaard Thompson stated that the experts knew that the drug worked, even though it could not be documented scientifically, and that this was the explanation for its extensive use. An interesting comment from a research director and a company that created a blockbuster out of hot air. This is how proponents of alternative medicine argue. That's it for chapter 9. I can barely talk.